The electricity between us unbelievably heightened each time I touched her skin. Occasionally, I noticed her glancing in my direction, though her expression was unreadable. Hoping to break her from her sullen mood, I started asking questions about her childhood again. I asked anything and everything I could think of to try to make her smile. Eventually, she started to relax again, and I noticed it made her pace speed up slightly. The more animated she got talking about her life, the faster she seemed to climb over the trees and rocks. She even stumbled significantly less. As the hours passed, the clouds began to disappear. The sun was shining, but the trees created such a dense cover above us. I knew my secret would be safe a little while longer. Bella's face was alight with joy when she noticed the sun through the trees, and she sped up her pace yet again. "Are we there yet?" she asked, feigning a frown at me. "Nearly," I promised, feeling my own anticipation growing. "Do you see the brightness ahead?" Should I?" she asked, squinting. "Maybe it's a bit soon for your eyes," I teased. "Time to visit the optometrist," she mumbled, rolling her eyes. I slowed down a bit as the sunlit meadow came into view. It was a place I'd retreated to many times, and I was thrilled to finally be sharing it with her. It had been a place of solitude, but now I felt certain its true beauty would be even more pronounced, because I would no longer have to be there alone. Bella was hurrying towards the stream of light, looking like an explorer about to unlock a hidden treasure. I walked a few steps behind her, basking in her excitement, and found myself holding my breath as she stepped into the sunlight. Her skin bathed in the warm light and her hair shining like spun gold, she had never looked more beautiful. From beneath the trees, I watched in awe as 21, she took in her surroundings. Her face was filled with pure joy, and I vowed in that moment to do anything for her, take her anywhere, if it meant she could always look that happy. For a moment, I simply breathed, letting the smells of the forest mingle with Bella's perfectly tortuous scent. I embraced the way it teased and tormented me, because it meant we were together, and I was in control of my need. Taking another deep breath, I let her happiness become my own. Her peace was my peace. There was nothing else in that moment but us, and the knowledge that my place of refuge no longer belonged to me alone. 22. Confessions EPOV. I waited at the edge of the meadow, still hiding under the shade of the tress. Bella walked slowly through the grass, eyes alight with wonder, and I couldn't help but smile right along with her. I wondered how long it would take her to notice I was no longer following her. She usually seemed all too aware of my presence. I watched her, thrilled to see the place that had brought me so much joy was making her happy as well. I wanted desperately to join her, yet I couldn't bring myself to step out into the sunlight. I wanted her to truly take in all the beauty of my personal sanctuary before I forever changed by adding the image of myself to it. Of course she would be frightened. I didn't doubt that for a moment. Secretly I'd wondered many times if the only reason Bella still didn't fear me was because I was so practiced at acting human around her. Aside from whatever fantasies her imagination had created, which in all honesty were probably nothing near the truth. She'd never seen me actually look like a vampire. Today I was going to show her something that would make me appear far from human, and she would be afraid. The side of me that wanted to protect her told me that was a good thing, but the side that had already grown too attached to our time together was terrified. As if sensing where my thoughts had taken me, she turned to look for me. I was surprised that her expression was concerned, and feared for a moment that I had walked too far into the sun and inadvertently revealed the truth before I was ready. Then her eyes found mine and her face instantly softened. She took a step towards me and reached her hand out like she wanted me to take it and join her. As much as I wanted to hold her hand in mine, longed to feel that spark her touch always ignited. I refused to feel the rejection that would most certainly follow when she saw my skin in the light. I couldn't bear to feel her hand ripped away from mine when the repulsion set in, so I held it up, silently urging her to wait just a little longer. I sighed and took in a deep breath of air I didn't need, and prepared for the moment I had both anticipated and dreaded. As I stepped out into the light, I kept my eyes firmly locked with hers, determined to see her initial reaction, and also not wanting to see the reflection off my skin. Yet I was unable to avoid seeing it reflect off of her own soft, perfect face, and I closed my eyes in frustration. Taking another unnecessary breath, I prepared for the worst. When I opened my eyes, would she still be standing with me, or would she have turned and ran, praying I wouldn't follow her? Reminding myself that a part of me wanted her to run, I forced my eyes open. And she was still standing in front of me, closer even than she was before, though I couldn't understand how. Unable to make sense of her expression and as always wishing I could read her mind, I pleaded to her with my eyes. Please tell me what you're thinking, they urged, and as if she had suddenly figured out how to read my mind, she reached out and took my hand and led me further into the meadow. Gently pulling me down with her, she crossed her legs and sat in the grass. Her eyes, warm and adoring and completely undeserved, never left mine. Whatever it was that kept her from being afraid of me the way any other human would seem to still be intact, despite my inarguably inhuman appearance. Though all I wanted was to bask in the sun with her and revel in the awe of her acceptance of me. I reminded myself why I had brought her here. I'd vowed to myself to be completely honest, even if it meant the day ending. 23, with her wanting nothing to do with me. If she was determined to try to be with me, she needed to know everything, the complete truth, hiding nothing. There was so very much to say. As difficult as it was for me to accept. Bella still seemed completely at ease around me. In fact, she looked fascinated, watching me like she wanted to touch my ridiculous skin. Deciding that the best way to proceed with our day of truth was to just be myself. I laid down in the grass facing up to the sky and closed my eyes. I tried to believe I was capable of acting the way I normally would if this was any other sunny day in my hideaway. I could pretend she wasn't there staring at me. I could convince myself not to notice the way the breeze was mingling her scent with the wildflowers and making my sanctuary nearly unbearable. Abruptly I opened my eyes. Terrified that I had already let my thoughts take me to the darkest of places, and focused again on her and the way she was watching me. There was no fear there, though I couldn't understand how. There was only warmth and affection. I let my eyes close once more and starting singing softly under my breath, the way I always did when I needed to find peace. I wasn't if she could see my lips move, though I was positive she couldn't hear me, but eventually she asked what I was doing. I told her simply that I was singing, but inside I wondered if she would ever know that although my voice was too soft for human ears, my heart was singing to her. I didn't expect her to close her eyes or lay down next to me. Even with her apparent lack of fear, she couldn't possibly want to put herself in such a vulnerable position. Every now and then, I would peek at her through barely opened eyes, just to see if anything in her expression had changed. She still watched me with curious eyes, and the slightest hint of a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. Just as I was about to chance another glimpse at her, I felt her finger brush against the back of my hand. My eyes flew open and I gazed wide-eyed at her. Unconsciously, I felt myself grin, baffled by why she would want to touch me but thoroughly enjoying the sensation of her warm skin on mine. Though I wasn't sure I was quite ready to hear the answer. I couldn't help asking the question I'd been holding in since I first stepped into the sunlight. I don't scare you? I asked, still smiling yet fighting against the pain I knew would come if her answer was yes. No more than usual, she replied casually, and I smiled wider as I realized she was telling me the truth. She always told me the truth, absurd as it might be. My smile must have encouraged her, because she scooted a fraction of an inch closer and let the rest of her fingertips run along my forearm. Her hand was shaking and I closed my eyes again, hoping the fear I'd been dreading wasn't finally starting to set in. Do you mind? She asked timidly, and I had to stifle a laugh. Did I mind? Her touch was the greatest feeling I'd experienced in the whole of my existence. No, I answered, debating how much I should say. Then remembering my vow of honesty I added, you can't imagine how that feels, with a sigh. I let my body sink further into the grass as her hand continued to trace my arm. I could feel her moving toward the inside of my elbow, so when she reached for my hand, I flipped it over, palm up. I must have moved too quickly because her fingers froze in place. I opened my eyes, desperate again to read her expression. She was startled, but there was still no trace of fear and I allowed my eyes to close once more. 24. Sorry, I mumbled, wishing she could understand just how strange all this was for me. I'd never allowed myself to be anything less than human around her before, yet already it felt right and natural. It's too easy to be myself with you. She continued inspecting my hand. Then out of nowhere I could feel her breath on my skin. I looked up to see my hand inches from her face. I was so close to her, and in that moment the intensity of the desire I'd been working so hard to control was almost too much. I needed a distraction. Very quickly. Tell me what you're thinking, I said softly, not wanting to alarm her with the severity of my voice. It's still so strange for me. Not knowing, the rest of us feel that way all the time. She said sarcastically. Internally I praised her for being able to lighten the moment when it was most crucial for her survival. Though I was trying not to focus on it, the realization of the danger that had just passed hit me. I tried to keep my voice relaxed, though knowing Bella, she'd see right through me. It's a hard life, I said, wishing with everything in me that I had some semblance of a normal life to give to her. She didn't deserve the kind of life I had to offer, yet it was all I had to give. And undoubtedly I would give her everything I had. The original reason for my question had all but vanished, but she still hadn't told me what she was thinking, and now I was curious. But you didn't tell me, I reminded her gently, hoping she hadn't been trying to distract me because she didn't want to answer. I had to know. I was wishing I could know what you were thinking. Her voice trailed off like she was waiting for me to tell her. Maybe it was selfish, but I had already revealed so much of myself to her, and now it was my turn. I had asked first, and I needed to hear the truth before anything else was said. And, I said simply, unwilling to budge just this once. I was wishing that I could believe that you were real. And I was wishing that I wasn't afraid, and there it was. I felt my breath catch as I took in her words. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. She was just very, very good at hiding it from me. I don't want you to be afraid, I said hopelessly. Foolishly, well, that's not exactly the fear I meant, though that's certainly something to think about, quickly and without thinking. I sat myself halfway up and leaned onto my arm, my other hand unfathomably still in her hand. Why had she not let go yet? She'd just told me she was afraid, yet she was still looking at me with those kind eyes, tender and not afraid at all. As I put her expression together with her words, they took on new meaning and sang through my mind like a beautiful symphony. Not exactly the fear I meant. If she wasn't afraid for her safety, what else there was for her to be afraid of? My mind raced through every possibility until I remembered her conversation with Jessica, the one she knew I was listening to. She'd been upset, concerned that she cared for me more than I did for her. And then she'd told me it bothered her that it seemed like sometimes I was trying to say goodbye. Was it possible that she was simply afraid of me leaving? Although I knew it would only encourage the thirst that was already painfully ripping at my throat. I let my face move infinitesimally closer to hers, taking in all of her wonderful and perfect 25%. If my guess was correct, I needed to know just how close she wanted to keep me. I had to hear her say it. What are you afraid of, then? I whispered, slowly letting out the full breath I had taken. Rather than answer me with the words I longed to hear, she inched her own face closer to mine. My throat burned and ached. The venom flowed under my tongue, and I felt my fist clench inside her fragile little hands. Without another thought, I did the opposite of what the monster inside was begging me to do. I fled. I ran with immeasurable speed back to the shadows and stared at her, wondering how many more times her life would be in danger today. As I looked at the pain on her face, I knew my earlier assumption had been correct. She was afraid I was going to leave her, and in a moment of weakness I had just confirmed that fear. I am sorry Edward, I heard her whisper. Her voice was so soft, but she knew I would hear. She already knew me so well. The agony that seared through me as I watched her silenced the thirst that had only moments ago been completely overwhelming. Give me a moment, I said, no longer afraid of hurting her but figuring we both needed time to collect ourselves. Knowing it would calm me as it always did. I listened to the sound of her heartbeat. When it had once again slowed to its normal pace, I walked deliberately slowly toward her, willing her not to be afraid of me or of my leaving again. I sat down in front of her, crossing my legs and mirroring her position. I smiled at her and tried to convey how much I wished I could stay beside her always. I am so very sorry. I wanted her to understand that my quick retreat was only for her protection. But now more than ever I didn't want to frighten her with the reality of my deplorable desire. Would you understand what I meant if I said I was only human? She nodded, though for the first time all day she didn't attempt a smile. She was starting to understand. I could feel her pulse speed up again, smell the adrenaline course through her veins. Though I hadn't imagined it possible, it only made her smell more desirable. I smiled sarcastically at the irony. She was finally afraid of me, and it only made me want her more. I'm the world's best predator. Aren't I said with a smirk. Everything about me invites you in my voice, my face, even my smell. As if I need any of that, with a sudden rush of excitement at the knowledge that there was no reason to hide anything from her anymore. I jumped to my feet and ran with all my strength around the meadow and stood once again in the shade. As if you could outrun me. I laughed, feeling some kind of sick pleasure in finally sensing her fear of losing me was greater than any fear I could incite in her. Without thinking about the ramifications, I ripped a thick branch from the tree that was sheltering me and threw it against another tree. I listened to the deafening sound as it shattered, then raced to her side again, feeling something akin to adrenaline in my own lifeless veins. As if you could fight me off. I teased. It was only then, as reality started coming back to me, that I began to take in her expression. Everything stopped. The excitement faded and my own momentary joy dissolved as I looked into Bella's eyes and for the first time, saw real fear. Bella was terrified. Of me. And it was my own fault. 26. My triumph turned to defeat, as the horror of what I had just done sank in. I'd always meant to show her what I was capable of, but what was I thinking, not giving her any warning at all. I'd let the excitement take over and cloud my judgment. And now Bella sat unmoving, paralyzed with fear, waiting for my next move. Don't be afraid. I murmured pathetically, wishing there was nothing for her to fear. I promise. My voice trailed off as I tried to find the words to reassure her that there was no danger. I was more in control in that moment than I had been all day, watching her, feeling her hurt. Her fear-filled blood more potent than it had ever been. I forced myself to take a deep breath, fill my entire being with her scent. As the burn threatened my will and urged me to act, I stared at Bella's innocent and terrified face and silenced it. Determined not to let it rule me any longer. I swear not to hurt you. I finished, making the vow to Bella and to myself at the same time. With all the conviction of my words filling me with hope, I took another slow step toward her. Don't be afraid, I repeated, this time with the knowledge that, if she would let me, I would spend my entire existence making sure she never had any reason to be afraid. Seeing her eyes soften slightly, I sat down in front of her once again, so close our knees were almost touching. I wanted to reach out to her but wasn't sure if it was too soon. Please forgive me, I said sincerely. She seemed puzzled by the formality of my tone, so I decided to lighten things up again, like she was so good at doing. I can control myself. I smiled. You caught me off guard. But I'm on my best behavior now. I was expecting a response, and when she didn't so much as blink, I grew concerned. Had I already done too much damage to be repaired? Desperate, I made one more attempt at light humor. I'm not thirsty today, honestly. I winked, happy my overindulgent hunting trip yesterday made that fact true, at least as far as my actual physical need was concerned. Finally her frozen expression broke and I reveled in the sound of her laughter, even if there was still something off about it. I wasn't yet sure if she was ready to touch me again, but I couldn't help myself. I was so worried about her and all I wanted to do was comfort her, reassure her. Are you all right? I asked softly. Then I reached my hand out, careful not to take hers in mine but rather letting it rest gently in her grasp. She needed to be the one in control now. I owed her that much. She took several quiet, shallow breaths as her eyes moved between our hands and my eyes. Finally she went back to tracing my hand with her fingertips and I sighed, relieved the worst seemed to be over. I smiled warmly at her, trying to get back the feeling we had before my irrational behavior. So where were we, before I behaved so rudely? I asked, wishing things could be easier for her. I honestly can't remember. She answered sheepishly, and the guilt washed over me once again. I think we were talking about why you were afraid, besides the obvious reason. Of course now I'd given her every reason to be afraid of me. After all that had transpired between us. I didn't deserve anything more than that fear. Yet still, I needed to hear her answer. Oh, right, well, it was ridiculous to hope for it, but I wanted to believe there was still a part of her that wanted me to stay. 27. As the seconds ticked by silently, it seemed less and less likely that her answer would be in my favor. As painful as I knew her next sentence might be, the anxiety of not knowing was getting the best of me. How easily frustrated I am. I sighed, trying not to upset her. I had to remember. I was letting her control things now. She could take as long as she needed to answer, and I would just have to channel every ounce of patience in me while I waited for her. I was afraid. Because, for, well, obvious reasons. I can't stay with you. And I'm afraid that I'd like to stay with you, much more than I should. If my heart could still beat, it would have started racing. It didn't seem possible that she could still want me, but I wasn't capable of dreaming, so this had to be real. She was staring at our hands again, but I wanted her to look up. I needed to look into her eyes, to make sure it wasn't just some facade to make me feel better. After all, she'd proven to me time and again how self-sacrificing she could be. It probably wasn't the best idea, but the only way I could think of to find out if what she was saying was really how she felt, was to mention the possibility of leaving. Although part of me still believed it would be for the best, the thought of being away from her caused me physical pain that rivaled any raging thirst she'd ever made me feel. Yes, I answered slowly. Not quite sure how to phrase it. I didn't want to upset her, or frighten her. But I had to know. That is something to be afraid of, indeed. Wanting to be with me. That's really not in your best interest. She frowned at me and I felt a glimmer of hope. Carefully, I continued, saying the words that threatened to tear me apart. I should have left long ago. I should leave now. But I don't know if I can. In a strangely human moment. I held my breath as I waited for her answer. I don't want you to leave. She mumbled, her eyes still refusing to meet mine. Thrilled and uncomprehending. I offered her a quick assurance, wanting her to understand that leaving wasn't really an option for me anymore. Which is exactly why I should. But don't worry. I'm essentially a selfish creature. I crave your company too much to do what I should. There was no keeping anything from her anymore. She'd finally started to understand how much I craved her blood, and now I sat beside her. Trying to make her understand that there were two kinds of desire I felt for her. I'm glad, she said sweetly. As much as I'd been keeping the relentless monster at bay. I couldn't forget his existence, and in that moment my urge to protect this innocent girl overcame my desire to be with her. Don't be, I said, perhaps a bit too harshly, as I pulled my hand away from her as gently as I could manage. My touch seemed to be distracting her, and I needed her to understand what I was about to say. It's not only your company I crave. I said, looking away, embarrassed once again by my weakness. Never forget that. Never forget I am more dangerous to you than I am to anyone else. I felt her eyes searching my face, yet in that particular moment of honesty. I couldn't bear to see what her eyes would reveal. 28. I don't think I understand what you mean by that last part anyway. She said. As I had been all day. I was expecting to hear fear in her voice, but all there was curiosity. When I looked back into her eyes, they were thoughtful, and I realized she wanted to know the truth as much as I wanted to tell it to her. It gave me the strength to continue. How do I explain? And without frightening you again. I sifted through several possible explanations, most of them involving food. I wondered idly if that would upset her. My thoughts were interrupted when I felt her squeeze my hand. I didn't remember having put it back in hers, but I was happy to feel her touch again. That's amazingly pleasant. The warmth. I sighed, wishing she could understand just how spectacular it really was for me. Over the years, I'd only ever had physical contact with my family, and of course all of their skin felt exactly like mine. Before Bella I hadn't felt warmth in so many decades. I'd almost forgotten what it was like. I marveled for another brief moment over the pleasure of her touch. Then forced myself to focus again. Deciding the food analogy was really the only way to explain it to a human. I sighed and tried to phrase my words carefully. You know how everyone enjoys different flavors. Some people love chocolate ice cream, others prefer strawberry. She nodded, though there was a hint of concern on her face, probably seeing where I was going with it. Sorry about the food analogy, I couldn't think of another way to explain. She smiled at me and it was obviously forced, so I smiled back at her apologetically. There was no turning back now and we both knew it. You see, every person smells different, has a different essence. If you locked an alcoholic in a room full of stale beer, he'd gladly drink it. But he could resist, if he wished to, if her were a recovering alcoholic. Now let's say you placed in that room a glass of 100-year-old brandy, the rarest, finest cognac, and filled the room with its warm aroma. How do you think you would fare then? She stared at me, trying to understand the temptation I was apparently failing miserably at explaining. I watched her expression shift from confused, to thoughtful, to somewhat accepting, then back to confused. Clearly she'd never been tempted beyond what she could tolerate. Never given in and eaten forbidden food. Hadn't every child stolen a cookie from the jar at some point? Maybe that's not the right comparison, I said, desperate to make her understand. Maybe it would be too easy to turn down the brandy. Perhaps I should have made our alcoholic a heroin addict instead. Finally it all seemed to click as I saw a brief flicker of fear in her eyes, which she quickly replaced with amusement. Amazing me as always, she made a joke. So what, you're saying it? I'm your brand of heroin, I smiled, showing her how much I appreciated her attempt to keep things light, but also wanting her to know that she was more right than perhaps she had realized. Yes, you are exactly my brand of heroin, without missing a beat, she asked. Does that happen often? 29. I thought for a moment, wondering how best to answer. I wanted her to know the danger and severity of the situation she'd found herself in, but I'd frightened her so much already. I struggled with the right way to say it. Maybe if it wasn't about us directly. I spoke to my brothers about it. To Jasper, every one of you is much the same. He's the most recent to join our family. It's a struggle for him to abstain at all. He hasn't had time to grow sensitive to the differences in smell, in flavor, though I hadn't been looking directly at her. I was fairly sure I saw her flinch from the corner of my eye. I looked swiftly back at her, wishing there was an easier way but needing her to understand why it was so much harder to control myself around her. She was so different from the rest of them, those humans I walked around with every day, barely a burn in my throat at all compared to her. My Bella and her heavenly scent, too delicious to resist but too precious to destroy. Sorry, I apologized. I don't mind. Please don't worry about offending me, or frightening me, or whichever. That's just the way you think. I can understand, or I can try to at least. Just explain however you can, relieved by her determination to understand. I summoned the strength to continue. So Jasper wasn't sure if he'd ever come across someone who was as. I trailed off. This was the hardest part. Explaining the intense desire without upsetting her further. Finding the right adjective. Delectable. Luscious. Exquisite. Inviting. The venom started to flow again, and I cursed myself for letting it get that far. I quickly continued my explanation, hoping she wouldn't notice the change in my voice. Appealing as you are to me. Which makes me think not. I finished conclusively, forcing back the thirst. Emmett has been on the wagon loner, so to speak, and he understood what I meant. He says twice, for him, once stronger than the other, and for you. Never, that was it. That was what I needed her to understand. There had never in my almost 100 years, been anyone who tempted me the way she does. The smartest thing for both of us would be for me to leave, yet neither one of us seemed able to accept that option. Still, it was only fair that she understand completely. I'd never pushed my resistance to the extreme like this. I couldn't truly be sure how long I could hold on. Then I remembered the way she'd leaned into me earlier without a trace of fear, and the vow I'd silently made to keep her safe, to let her be close to me without giving her a reason to be afraid. I forced another deep, intoxicating breath, and let the burn strengthen my resolve. I was not going to allow the monster within to take such a precious gift from the man who so desperately wanted nothing more than to love her. Lost in my thoughts. I almost didn't hear her when she spoke again. What did Emmett do? She asked, and instantly I went rigid. My hand made a fist inside hers, and no amount of her warmth and comfort could relax it. I wasn't going to answer her, and she knew it. Nothing could make me form those words. I guess I know, she said, trailing off sadly. 30. There was no reason for it. She wasn't accusing or condemning him, but still I felt the urge to defend my brother. Even the strongest of us fall off the wagon. Don't we? What are you asking? My permission, she said in the harshest tone I'd ever heard her take. I was so stunned.